Book club. I almost wanted to call it a celebration, and why shouldn't it be? Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up this beautiful Saturday morning here in Reno, Nevada. Wherever you're coming from, our theater company is based in Reno, Nevada. We are called Bruka Theater, and my name is Mary Bennett. I'm the producing artistic director. We are 29 years in downtown Reno, celebrating and continuing through, and we are so happy to have all of you here at our premiere event of this book club. I wanted to start off by saying we believe that a theater book club is delving deeper into the subjects around our plays and the themes that we address in our plays and our seasons, and it can create a more connected community, and you are all proof of that. We ask you if you will please keep your mics muted at the top of the book club as we have our presentation with Wendy Swallow, author of Searching for Nora, and our director and assistant director and dramaturg, Hearn and Jessica Johnson, as we talk about Searching for Nora and A Doll's House Part 2. We do believe that these two books come together so beautifully, and I just wanted to thank Charlie Shepard, who reached out to us and found a connection between Wendy's book and our theater company, and it's all about people reaching out. So thank you so much to Charlie. And with that in mind, I think it's time that we open our conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you Wendy Swallow.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to start out explaining why Henrik Ibsen's original play, A Doll's House, has created many sequels, but notably today, the sequel play, A Doll's House Part 2 by Lucas Nath, and my novel, Searching for Nora by me. So Henrik Ibsen's play, A Doll's House, has stunned audiences and ignited controversy since it was premiered in Copenhagen in 1879. Ibsen, Norway's greatest playwright, is considered a giant of world literature and known in theater circles as the father of realism. He started out writing mythic plays about heroes, but soon turned to more modern dramas with intimate portraits of flawed heroes grappling with social and moral problems. The Center for Ibsen Studies in Oslo says that Doll's House is the second most performed play in the world after Hamlet. So that's some lasting power. One of Ibsen's core beliefs was that individuals have a responsibility to chart their own moral course rather than blindly complying with social norms. In A Doll's House, Ibsen extended that expectation to women, which was a radical act at the time. Excuse me. He does it through the character of a young mother who initially appears ill-prepared to take on the world. In the first act of Doll's House, Nora Helmer, who is married to Torvald, appears to be little more than a typical Victorian-era housewife. She's flighty, a little wheedling, dependent on the largesse of her husband and the comfort of her parlor. We learn in the second act that Nora has strengths and ideals, but hasn't always known how best to deploy them. By the end of the play, however, Ibsen has Nora speak her truth and take on the mantle of self-responsibility in a shining moment of courage and self-realization. But in the process, Nora cracks open her marriage. Her final act is to walk out on her family, slamming the door as she goes. This moment, which so rocked the world in its day, is now known as the slam heard round the world. Ibsen's central theme In A Doll's House is the conflict between the ideal and the real. His characters hide their true nature from each other and themselves, and both Nora and Torvald have trouble seeing, much less accepting, each other as they really are. The issue is as fresh today as it was in 1879. We are entranced and simultaneously a little horrified because we recognize the Helmer's problems as similar to our own. The other powerful driver of Doll's House is Ibsen's iconic blazing heroine, Nora. She's a maddening charmer. Like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina and Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Nora bewitches and confounds generation after generation. Playwright Wade Bradford said this about her: as one of the most complex characters of 19th century drama, Nora Helmer prances about in the first act, behaves desperately in the second act, and gains a stark sense of reality during the finale of Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. Nora's many layers have challenged critics and scholars for years. She's silly and flirtatious, but also duplicitous and manipulative. She's nervous as a bird caught in a cage and existentially troubled. She's an actress playing the part of a powerless innocent, or she's a vain narcissist controlling the strings of her world. She is beautiful and naive, self-dramatizing and loving. She lies to everyone and at the same time exposes the hypocrisy of her age. There's no denying the power of Nora's character, even if she seems to be spinning apart when she dances a frantic tarantella halfway through Ibsen's play. She is the molten, hungry, unstable center of Ibsen's drama. And then she walks away from all she knows, out into a cruel, cold world. As the curtain falls, Ibsen leaves the audience with the same binary tension between idealism and reality. Is Nora's final act of leaving her home and family a liberating step towards self-fulfillment? Or is it a frightening step into the abyss of suicide or worse? Clearly, Lucas, Nath, and I were intrigued by the possibilities.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Very well said. And it's just fascinating to listen to you talk about Nora. She's such a fascinating character. And I also want to say it's really fun. We have our Nora here today, Kimberly Gibbons from A Doll's House Part 2. So I'll look forward to see if Nora has some questions and answers for us at the end of our talk today. So now we're going to bring in Jessica and Rod Hearn, our director of A Doll's House Part 2 at Brüka, and Jessica Johnson, our assistant director and dramaturg, to speak to some of the things that drew them to the production. Especially, we'll start talking with the original production and have them piggyback on any thoughts they have from Wendy's initial conversation.
Hi, this is Rod Hearn. I'm gonna just go ahead and jump right in here, and then Jessica will kind of tag team this little section. So I came across this script. I'd heard of it before, but had not read it or anything. And I was at a virtual state thespian conference for high schools and had a chance to hear Laurie Metcalf in an interview talk a little bit about her experience being on Broadway in this show. And the more she talked, the more I thought, gosh, I think I'd really like to read this script. So I ordered it, I read it, and then I shared it with Mary, and Mary really liked it. And so then discussion turned into let's produce this and I'll direct it. So we did. And I think one of the things that drew me to this is that the script doesn't provide any neat answers about relationships and marriage. It's very messy. And just when you think you know where it's going, a character will say something that makes you think differently. And so your alliances shift. I think identifying who really is the protagonist and antagonist off and on throughout the play is shifty and I think rewarding that way. Early on, an image of like a kind of a mostly bare room, and in our production is a square, kind of reminds me of a boxing ring a little bit, and where two characters kind of go at each other for a bit and you're never really sure who is winning. So those are the things that brought me to this. I've taught high school English and drama for many years, and I've taught A Doll's House off and on many times over 30 years. And while I've never seen a production of A Doll's House, what it's about and its significance in theater history has remained kind of in the forefront of my mind. And so I'm thankful to have an opportunity to kind of interact with that classic text, but in this newer way.
And Jessica Johnson here. Similarly, I found that I never have seen a production of A Doll's House, but it being taught as an essential text in many high schools, and for me in college, in my theater program at Chapman University, it remains this enduring text that still has so much to say. And I think that we'll find throughout this book club discussion that that is primarily the reason why Nath approached this play in the way that he did, is really analyzing the ways in which we maybe haven't come as far as we have thought that we have in terms of gender equality, and how that shifts depending on time period and demographic. But I think that that really goes to show the enduring nature of Ibsen's play, insofar as in 2006, which was the centennial of Ibsen's death, it was the most performed play in the world. And I think that it really is fitting in a discussion comparing it to this part 2 of the play, in that 12 years later, when A Doll's House Part 2 was out on the theater scene, it became the most produced play in America in the 2018-2019 season, playing in 27 theaters nationwide. So there's a lot of issues that these plays together bring up, and that's the reason why the story of Nora remains so enduring today. I had an opportunity to actually see A Doll's House Part 2 performed at the Pacific Playwrights Festival, which was its world premiere in Southern California. And so it was very fulfilling to be able to board this production here at Brüka and bring a new aspect to this play, 5 years after it originally debuted.
And I would like to add on to what you're saying. First of all, I just think it's a gift in our community that we have people thinking about these subjects, writing about them, and wanting to bring them to the stage. We've had a lot of people ask us, do I need to see part 1 if I'm going to see part 2? Comes up all the time. And we've tried to say no. What you need to know is that Nora walks out the door of her marriage and her life, and she comes back 15 years later. But in terms of meeting Wendy and then seeing the way that you guys have brought this artistically to the stage, there's so much more to Nora than meets the eye. And so she's truly an onion as you peel away these layers of who this person is. And the two different aspects, I think that the approaches are really interesting. And I wonder if you guys, and we might, Wendy might have something to say about this in here or something later. So I don't want to cut her off what she had, but the way that the playwright comes to Nora is a bit different than Wendy. And we've had that conversation a couple of times. Rod or Jessica, can you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure, I'll jump in first, and then Jessica just pick up everything I leave behind in shambles and clean that up. So I think the play starts with many audience members kind of rooting for Nora, kind of like a "you go, girl." There's an early moment in the play where the housekeeper, who is a mother figure to Nora, is engaging in a game with Nora, trying to figure out, like, what have you been doing with yourself? She looks really good. She's dressed to the nines, and so she appears to be successful. And the nature of that game makes you kind of root for Nora. And when she discloses how she's made money and how she's kind of come out of that door slam 15 years earlier, it kind of puts the audience, I think, just right away on Nora's side and thinking, oh, you go, girl, that's really good for you. Good for you. And then things sort of unravel and the volleying begins back and forth. Like I mentioned, a boxing match, while nobody's punching each other, there's a lot of verbal sparring that goes back and forth. And and interesting relationship perspectives are exchanged back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so then our, I think, audience alliance with Nora that is sort of set up in the beginning starts to become fuzzier and messier throughout the play. And I find that really satisfying to work on.
Yeah, and to what you were saying, Rod, about it being a boxing match, that was Nath's original approach. He began writing A Doll's House Part 2. Initially, he just wanted to make a translation of Ibsen's text as it would be spoke in a modern context. And you'll see that in A Doll's House Part 2, all the characters use contemporary dialogue, ways in which we would talk today. And so that he was mostly just doing it as a writing exercise. And then he started to strip away part and imagine what would this return to this household for Nora be like, and which characters would he really want to spend time with. And he actually says, a direct quote from him says, at a certain point, it made sense to strip down to what basically are a series of two-person showdowns, like a series of boxing rounds, which is closer to how I write most of my plays anyway, instead of doing an Ibsen tribute band. So he really wanted to make it more of a character study, I think. And that's really where you find this very interesting switching of allegiances between character to character as each scene progresses, because what Nath is more interested in doing is making a character study of these four particular characters that he has picked. He could have picked a slew of characters from the original Doll's House. There's many more of Torvald's fellow employees and neighbors and all of that, but he chose these four specific characters because he's so interested in playing with the power dynamic, in unpacking discussions of gender equality, of the purpose of marriage. And so it's more of I think it reflects more about contemporary audiences than it does necessarily remaining historically authentic toward the time period, or it being about only Nora's story, because it very much is about the other three characters as well.
Excellent. Thank you. If you haven't seen the play yet, you're probably just dying to. And also, if you haven't read Wendy's book yet, you're probably as excited about that. So now let's go to Wendy. And Wendy, what drew you now to write this sequel to Doll's House?
Well, I have to say that I wrote my novel. Wait a minute, hold on. One place. I'm sorry. I've been intrigued by Nora Helmer since I first saw the play when I was in college. And, I was, 20 years old, and I cheered as everyone else did when Nora walked out the door. But then I saw the play again 15 years later when I was going through a divorce of my own at the time with two small children. And when I watched Nora go out the door, I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I was immediately thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen to her? Like this shining moment may work for a moment, but it's not going to last. So I thought about her quite a bit as I was getting divorced, which was the hardest thing I'd ever tried to do. And, and yet compared to Nora, I had a good job. I had the right to care for my children. I had the right to enter into contracts and keep my own money. Plus I had an understanding and supportive community, but Nora had none of that. So here's the man, Henrik Ibsen. For Ibsen's contemporaries, Nora's final act of leaving her family was far more complicated than modern audiences appreciate, because the world was not ready for her yet, and Ibsen knew that. And given that, I felt very strongly about keeping the play and my novel in the time period of Ibsen when he was writing, because I think actually the play is more powerful and dramatic and cataclysmic if seen from an 1879 lens. I also wrote the book partly because I felt like Nora's story was that Doll's House as a play was just half of Nora's story. So when I started out, I had two central questions. The first one was, what might have happened to a woman like Nora in 1879 Norway if she had done what Nora did? And then the second question was much more nuanced. It was, how would Nora change and grow as she grappled with the tragic consequences of her decision to leave her children and her husband? I was interested in what Nora's emotional and psychological journey would look like. And I realized early on that I needed the space and breadth of a novel to show that. So really quickly, this is a little synopsis about my novel. As the curtain falls on Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House, Nora Helmer slams the door on her comfortable life and sets out to find her true self. My novel starts with her on the other side of that slammed door. It's late December, after midnight, on a cold Norwegian night. She has little money and no one to guide her. Worse, it's 1879. She has no right to property or to see her children, and will soon be cast out of her privileged class. Based on the historical realities of her time, I send Nora on a journey that impoverishes her and educates her, sweeps her onto an emigrant ship bound for America, and strands her on the harsh Minnesota prairie. She's searching for love and purpose, but struggles to be honest in a hostile world. There's a second story in my book, a story about legacies and family that alternates with Nora's tale. In that story, it's 1919, and World War I has brought a challenging new modernity to Norway. Sylvie Lang is a young university student who struggles to escape her family's bourgeois conformity and works to unravel the twin mysteries of her grandfather's hidden shame and the fate of a shadowy feminist who vanished years earlier. And the Nora and Sylvie stories are braided together. It took me 10 years to write this book. I went to Norway, which was wonderful, and I went all over Minnesota, where Nora ends up. I interviewed immigration historians and Ibsen scholars and did extensive work in the Norwegian American archives, reading prairie diaries and immigration accounts. After all this research, I came to the conclusion that there were several inescapable truths about Nora's situation that I used as parameters for my story. So the first important thing to understand is that Norway in 1879 is undergoing a dramatic social and economic upheaval. The Great Norwegian Migration to America and Canada, which ultimately drains a third of the Norwegian population away from Norway, that had already emptied the uplands and the farms of able-bodied young men, leaving the farms to be handled only by old people in many villages, and many women without life partners. Not surprisingly, there were economic problems, labor unrest, and explosion of prostitution, especially in the cities. All of these are themes that are laced through Ibsen's plays. This is Asta Hanstein. So at the moment, at that time in Norway, the status of women was fairly weak, especially for married women who had fewer rights than single women. Asta Hanstein, as you see here, was a well-educated portrait painter. And she at the time was the only woman speaking out publicly in Norway about anything, and her topic was women's rights as human rights. She, however, was often heckled when she gave speeches, so she left for America around the time Ibsen's play premiered. She said at the time she had to go. She was afraid of being arrested, to be honest. She said she left for America at that time because the ground was burning beneath her feet in Norway. So Hanstein is often portrayed with an umbrella. This is a statue of her in Norway. So this is her, the middle picture is her as a young woman. And then this is a self-portrait of her down in the lower right. And then the statue of her with the umbrella. She was often portrayed by the cartoonists in Norway with the umbrella because she allegedly once hit a member of parliament over the head with the umbrella. Apparently she wasn't listening to what she had to say. So one of the things I realized after I learned about Asta Hanstein was that in this environment, it would have been very hard for Nora to become a public figure speaking out for women's rights. I mean, Asta Hanstein could barely pull it off herself, and she had a lot more education and social cachet. I was more interested really in how Nora, a private individual trying to assert her independence in the world, would navigate a system that gave her little rights and few advantages. She would have had no right to any property or money. Everything she owned, including her clothing, belonged to her husband. And she had no right or responsibility to care for her children. That was all within her husband Torvald's legal authority. At the time, divorce was rare and very difficult to attain. This is a picture of the English actress Hattie Morahan. She played Nora in a Young Vic production from London of A Doll's House that was staged in Brooklyn, New York. And that's Nora with one of her children. She has 3 children in the play, 2 boys and a 2-year-old baby girl. So I was pretty sure that Nora would wake up the morning after she left home and realize that leaving her children behind was a serious problem. Readers have asked me, why doesn't she just bundle them up in their pajamas and take them with her? Well, it's winter for starters in Norway, and she's not sure really where she's going when she leaves. Under the law at the time, Torvald could have had the police round up the children and would have brought them home, and Torvald could have blocked Nora from seeing them ever again. But it is a terrible choice that she has to make. To get out of her bad marriage, she needs to give up her children. But I was convinced that this choice would haunt Nora because it was going to become something she had to fix. And much of my novel is about her coming to terms with this problem. I also realized there were few people in her day who would have understood why she left her marriage. I realized this after reading the reaction to Ibsen's play when it first premiered. It was the talk of Europe. It was a firestorm of criticism and debate. Men were deeply offended that Nora left her husband, and women were deeply offended that she left her children. They might have understood why she left Torvald, but they didn't understand why she could leave her children. And one famous actress refused to play Nora because she left her children. Nora's own social circles probably assumed she left with another man, which was a highly immoral act at that time. Because of that, they would have ostracized her. Ibsen, writing and commenting about the play later, however, made it clear that his intention was that Nora went on her own. That was a radical act he meant for her to take. He was not interested in having her go out the door and 2 weeks later hook up with some other guy. He wanted to see what she could do, or have us imagine what she could do on her own. But for a woman of her class, this behavior would have made her radioactive. So because of that, it would have been hard for her to get a job. As a bourgeois lady, she was too well bred to be hired as a clerk or a maid or a factory worker, all of which she tries in my book. And because of the scandal around her, she would not have been appropriate as a teacher for young women or a governess or even as a companion. And at this time, America was the dream of Norwegians in trouble or out of luck. And that began to sound like Nora. So here we are in Lucky Park County, Minnesota in the 1880s. It's fairly primitive compared to life in Christiania, Norway. What I wanted working within those parameters were certain things for Nora to experience. I wanted her to wrestle with her own morality, including her need to lie and to hide the truth, especially her own truth. To do that, I had to put her in challenging situations and test her limits. I wanted her to get outside of her narcissism and self-absorption. She is fairly narcissistic in Ibsen's play. I wanted to see her find a purpose in the world beyond family and love. Work is important to Nora. I wondered if she could find a calling. And I wanted to get her to a place where ultimately she could stand honestly before the world, where she could tell her difficult truths and still be accepted and loved. I thought the American prairie, with its primitive, stripped down existence and limited community, might give Nora a chance to rebuild herself and find her place in the world. So just let me say one or two things about the secondary tale, the story of Solveig Lang. Solveig is emblematic of the group of young women who came of age at the end of World War I. This is a generation that takes their mothers and grandmothers, the rights that their mothers and grandmothers fought for, and this generation really starts to build lives on them. Sylvie is from a wealthy family, but she has a rebellious spirit. She's a girl with Nora's fire in her belly. She wants to work and do something important. She wants to make a difference. Like Nora, she rejects the parlor, the life of the parlor expected of bourgeois women. But Sylvie has more rights and opportunities, so she can follow her ambition in ways that Nora couldn't. She's a budding photographer because I've always been interested in artists and those who see the world with more attention. And she's also a budding historian. She's a university student, and the threads of her life and character come together and send her off on a search for a dimly remembered early Norwegian feminist. So one last note, as part of the Bruka Book Club, Mary and I are scheming to return for a book club discussion for people who've read the book and would be interested in doing that. You can find out a lot more about my book at searchingfornora.com, and you can also contact me through the website. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I love the detailed research so much and the photos that you've brought into it. And so I want to turn to Jessica first. Jessica Johnson, assistant director and also the dramaturg on this play, did quite a bit of research on this production and put together a wonderful educational packet that's available on our website, which is bruka.org. And if you click on the top, there's a link that takes you into the Doll's House page. And so there's an online program, but there's also this incredible education packet that you've put together, Jessica. So I'm curious, by watching this wonderful research and that storyline from Wendy, if that brought up anything for you with the research that you went about doing for Doll's House Part 2.
Yes, absolutely. I think more than anything that it's so interesting the ways in which in which your approach, Wendy, is very similar to Lucas Nath. There are, of course, many differences in the path that Nora takes after leaving. But I think that essentially, I mean, both of them become feminist icons in their own way. I mean, in Nath's vision, she goes on and kind of fills Ibsen's role and writes a story that is basically her own story and becomes a text that has widespread impact on the Norwegian population of women. And in your approach for Nora, the very quiet ways in which that just the slamming of the door was all it took, and the story trickles out, and Nora has this lasting impact. And I think that in terms of the research I did for both our production and for this educational packet, it all comes down to this question of why this play now? And I think it's just so interesting that Wendy's book and this play came out in very similar time periods, right as we as a society were asking many questions in a post-Me Too movement world about gender equality and expectations as well. One of the things that Lucas Nath did in recognizing that he himself is a white man is he said, I shouldn't necessarily be the one. I'm glad that I'm telling this story. It's my vision. I have a very clear intent, but I want to make sure that I'm telling it the right way. And he took the play in its early drafts before a feminist panel of women's studies professors at the University of North Carolina, where he teaches. And he asked them what would be the equivalent of that shock ending of Ibsen's play, of Nora slamming that door and leaving her life. And it was shocking to him to find that these women all believed that it's still a shocking ending today, that there is such an idea of a woman as a caregiver, as the essential figure in a family to take care of the children. And the fact that she leaves her children behind is still the most stunning thing to have happened over 100 years later. So that really informed Lucas Nath and gave him the reason to say, why this play now? And the fact that it is such a well-produced piece in America and continues to be told, I think tells us all that we need to know, that these are still stories that we need to hear today. And it's so exciting that, Wendy, you also told this story from a different aspect and infused so much of real history and the rich history of Norwegian immigration that we've had to this country. I think that it's really fascinating.
Very well put, Jessica. Wendy, I'm curious if you could, and I know you have a lot of your readers that are here today, but we have a few folks, I think, from the theater, and you've referenced the Sisters of Norway quite a bit. I'm wondering if you could speak to who this group is. And I'm assuming from your research and what you saw that a lot of the immigration went to Minnesota, thus you choosing Minnesota as a landing spot for Nora.
Well, the group that I've been working with is actually the Daughters of Norway. There's also a Sons of Norway, and they're the two biggest groups of Norwegian American descendants in America, and they're all over the country. And there are quite a few in the Pacific Northwest, because after many of the Norwegians went to the American Midwest and endured 10 years of blizzards in North Dakota, they left for Seattle, basically. So they're all over the country. They're a wonderful group. They're fascinated by their own history. They know their literature well. They all know Ibsen very well. But one thing that's been really interesting to me and connects with what Jessica was just saying is that when we talk about this book, many of the women share sort of haunting stories of their own grandparents and great-grandparents' immigration experience. I mean, part of what Nora finds on the American prairie is a lot of mental health problems among the women, and it's desolate, and people are lonely, and they're nostalgic for Norway. It's a very tough world. It's like going back in time. It's so primitive. Nora says that at one point. She's like, you know, she comes from a nice townhouse in Oslo, like, so it's pretty primitive for her to be on the prairie. But it was so interesting to me how many women have told me or emailed me and said things like, this book has just brought up all these issues of experiences for my mother or grandmother when they didn't feel like they had the opportunity to do things. And, you know, it's really been interesting. Some women have shared stories of abuse, and this play, you know, Ibsen's Doll's House and Nate's Doll's House Part 2 and my book all tap this deep well of stories and history for women. So it's really been an amazing experience to talk to all these Daughters of Norway and other book clubs I've done across the country.
It's really exceptional, the fact that you know, there's therapy through art for all of us, right? In terms of being able to watch or read or experience someone else's journey. And I think this is a very important one. I'm a Nora, and I don't think about it very often, but when Rod brought the play, it brought up a lot of things, because I'm a contemporary Nora, and people do not look upon that very gracefully. And still in our contemporary society, it's difficult to try to leave a marriage that isn't going well and try to move on with your life as a woman, especially when you have children involved. And when you fill in that blank, and as you said, you have had this experience as well. When you fill in those blanks, it's very close to the heart. When you watch someone else go through it, I think it helps you move through it yourself. So it's a beautiful thing. I wanted to talk to Rod very quickly. I know that I actually got to see a production of Doll's House. I've seen two of them. One down at ACT in San Francisco when I was going to school down there. And then I got to see our Holly Natwara do it with RLT 10 years ago, I believe, here in Reno. And I'm curious, Rod, if putting up Doll's House Part 2 gave you any inspiration to want to put up a Doll's House Part 1, or has this filled that space for you?
That's, you know, I don't actually. You know, my interest in classical theater is, I think, often centered around multiple perspectives. And so I am fascinated when a contemporary or more contemporary playwright than the original piece takes a look at some classical literature or play and asks themselves, like, what does someone else in a more peripheral way, what do they think about this story? Or I'm just interested in the reverberations of all of that. I'd say more than I am interested in restaging a classic as it is. And so I think that is really what is attractive to me, is the newness of it. And sometimes I think that is also a way to perhaps connect a classical piece of theater to a more contemporary audience, is provide a new story or a new angle that kind of pulls things together. One of the things I think I'm interested in, if we're good on time, I know Mary, you're our timekeeper, so thank you for doing that, is since we do have Nora and Anne-Marie here, the actors who play them, Kim Gibbons and Janet Lazarus, if they are interested in sharing any perspectives on that sort of thing about, like, would they want to play the characters in A Doll's House, Ibsen's version, or maybe a perspective on what this more contemporized version kind of has brought to them, like challenges or things that resonate in a positive way.
Kimberly, let's start with you. If you want to unmute and you would like to say hi and we can see your face.
Hey. I don't know about going back to the original A Doll's House. I think I'm kind of more on the same page with Rod, where I like exploring kind of that new take on things. Something I did notice when we started to really approach this piece and looking at the whole concept of marriage and how we get into marriage and what forces us at times to stay in a marriage that isn't ideal. I related to this on so many levels through my family and my parents and watching somewhat dysfunctional type marriage relationship, and watching my mom kind of go through so many of the things that Nora points out that are ridiculous in some ways about a marriage and why we stay. And so I was able to relate to it that way, kind of more in this modern world, and see that, you know, that's still existing. And it's kind of, I guess, also kind of gave me some explanation, you know, and possibly ways to approach her, my mother, and have these conversations. My father recently passed, and so, you know, my mom saw the show on opening night, so I'm interested now to kind of see what her perspective is, looking back on, you know, this piece and her marriage, and how so many of these things are just so true and in some ways sad, and just I don't know.
It's interesting. It's a very difficult story, and yet there is humor in the play and in the book, and in the, you know, there are all these different amazing sides to this very layered story. Thank you so much, Kimberly. And you can all come see Kimberly play Nora in Doll's House Part 2. Janet, I didn't know if you had anything that you would like to add to that as well.
I'm going to speak on a very personal level, just like Kimberly did. I am somebody who left a marriage, but waited until my kids were leaving for college. And I think that speaks volumes to Anne-Marie's attitude, because I feel like that's a very pervasive attitude, is that, I mean, I know plenty of women that leave a marriage and figure out how the kids are going to be raised and all that stuff. My own personal choice was to wait. And I feel very much that I sacrificed maybe my own happiness in some ways, on some levels, for the benefit of my children's being able to stay in a stable environment. Now, one can argue the pros and cons of all of that. Of course, that's not the purview of our conversation here. But so it's easy for me to connect to Anne-Marie's attitude about, you know, you left your children, you narcissist. You know, that's a really important part of the play. The other thing is, for me, and I saw the play with Laurie Metcalf and Chris Cooper on Broadway, and I was absolutely just floored by the work. And that's why I wanted to do this play, because I really love it. And I think it really brings to light so many important issues about feminism. I was in college in the 70s, and I was reading all the feminist books, and it really spoke to me. And I looked at my mother, who was so dependent on my father, and he treated her like crap. And so I had this whole background of, yes, women need to be their own independent people. And so there's that, right? but then the whole question of, well, how do you make a marriage work? And my own difficulties in making a marriage work and a relationship work. And how do you do that? That is something so universal, and we need to get it into the public dialogue. How do we do this, guys? What's the right way of making a marriage work? And is there value in marriage? And the question of there being value in marriage, I'm having conversations with my son, who's 28, who's telling me that marriage is a thing of the past. This is the new generation. This is our young adults coming up and saying, why get married? What's the point? So this is all in this play.
Yes.
I think it's great.
That's great, Janet. Thank you so much. And you can also come see Janet in A Doll's House Part 2 as Anne-Marie, who sacrifices not only for Nora's character and raises her, but then raises Nora's children. It's a fascinating character dynamic in this story as well. I'll just recap really quickly. Up on the screen right now is how you can not only reach Wendy on her searchingfornora.com site, but you can also access her book and order her book through the website or through Amazon as well. Is that correct, Wendy?
Yes, there's a buy the book page, and it lists all the different ways you can get the book.
Excellent. And we will also have Wendy as our guest tomorrow at our matinee, which still has tickets available. The matinee is at 2 p.m. on Sunday at Brüka Theater at Brüka. The doors open at 1:30, and it really is an exceptional show. Doll's House Part 2 will run through February 18th. And now I would love it if we had some questions or comments from our audience. And Wendy, I will ask if you can stop sharing your screen for a moment so we can go to the gallery view and see all of our faces in here.
Lovely.
Excellent. And if you have your screen up and you have a comment or a question you want to raise your hand, or if you have the raising hand feature as well on our Zoom, we'd love to have a comment or a question for our author or our directors or our actresses who are here as well. I'm going to ask Juliet a question. No, I want to see if how many people here, if we can take a survey, because I was so curious how many people had seen the original Doll's House as a play. How many of us have seen the original Doll's House play? I would be one of those hands. So we have 1, 2, 3. Yes, we do. Excellent. 4-ish. Kimberly's like, yes, I saw it. Yes. Oh, Martha's in. Excellent. So about 5 people. We also have Holly Natwara here. Holly, if you would open up your screen. She's like, I didn't get ready this morning. Hi, Holly. She's like, I'll show you for a minute. Holly works with Bruka. She's our operations director, but an incredible theater artist. And Holly did play Nora 10 years ago at RLT. And I was curious, Holly, if you were able, I know you came in a little bit later, but were able to see all of the research that Wendy had done. Did you research Nora on your original production as deeply as Wendy had gone into understanding the pieces of Norway and what she would have been going through there?
Yeah, I think research is key, right? I love research, both as an actor and as a director. You can't possibly begin to play a character if you don't know the world in which they live, right? And so it's so important. And as an actor also, I was taught to research not only the world of the character, but also the world in which the playwright lived, because the playwright also is impacted by the world in which they come from, right? So yes, I did an extensive research. I'm very excited though to read the book. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I can hardly wait to get a copy tomorrow. So yes, I did a lot of research. And I think that, one of the things that popped into my head while I was listening to everything, and the question that I actually want to ask Wendy is, we all think that we could do something in a particular situation, right? Like me as a woman, I'd be like, I'm out of there, right? I'd be so out of there. But Wendy did all of that research and explored the world of what happened after she left. And so my question to Wendy would be, knowing what you know now about what she had to experience, would you, as Nora, have still made the choice to leave?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I have sometimes said to myself, if I had known how hard it was to get divorced and raise my children in the shadow of that, would I have had the courage to do it? And then I think about Nora's situation and what Nora goes through to find herself with me at the helm. Probably would have been pretty daunting if she had had any idea what it would take. I mean, she is naive of the world. Torvald accuses her of that in the last act of the play, and he's correct about that. She's very naive. And yet Ibsen has also given her her own agency, which the irony of the play, and I have to say, there's a little shout out for Ibsen's play, the original Doll's House. It is an awesome play. I have read it hundreds of times. It's many layered, but the coolest thing about it is it's very contemporary. The voice of it, it doesn't feel like it's 140 years old. You feel like, you as a reader, feel like you're hiding in the Helmer's coat closet, listening to them bicker and negotiate. And it's incredible. So on my website, there's I have a synopsis of the play, of Ibsen's play. There's also a link to the Gutenberg site, which has the play available. It's out of copyright because it's so old. So I would recommend, it's actually well worth rereading the Ibsen play. It will only take you an evening. It takes as quickly as it takes to see it. The other thing is there are two movies, both produced in 1973, an American one with Jane Fonda as Nora and an English one with Claire Bloom as Nora. In the English one, Anthony Hopkins is Torvald, and frankly, he kind of steals the show, but they're both still well worth seeing. The American one with Jane Fonda is shot in Norway, and it actually takes the action outside of the Helmer's parlor more, and so it's beautiful. The other one, the English one, is more like a stage production. But anyway, Ibsen's original play is just filled with so many layers. I mean, it's really hard to sort of capture it all in a quick talk. But
I love doing it. I just loved being her and having that moment of awakening. Right. We all have an opportunity to have an awakening in our lives, you know, and sometimes many awakenings in our lives. And so for me, that was the joy in playing the character, is having that moment of realizing I have to change the situation, and only I can change the situation because I am worthy of changing the situation. I have value, I have worth. And that's such an important lesson for all of us to know, whether you're a woman or a man or anyone. We all have to understand that we have value as human beings, and our lives matter, and our voices matter, and our experience is valid. I think that's what I got out of playing her in the original piece.
It's beautiful. And there's opportunity, right, that lies ahead, and oftentimes can be pretty complicated. So beautiful. Thank you all so much. Any other questions or comments for Wendy or our creative staff that is here today? Yes, Edie.
Edie, we can't hear you. Can't. Oh well.
I think, Edie, yes, we can hear you.
It's amazing if you have the printer plugged into the mic jack, it doesn't work.
More cables than ports.
So Wendy, I've heard you talk about the research that you did. And one thing that interested me is that you said that in Norway, you know, everybody has their own theory what happened to Nora after the play ends. And so I was kind of wondering, what are some of the theories that you heard?
Well, that's a great question, Edie. I was really amazed in Norway. It's a little bit like a parlor game over there, you know, what happened to Nora. And so various things. One big Ibsen scholar said to me, well, of course she becomes an actress. So that was one thing. Some people said, you know, she lived underground, you know, as a secret feminist. Many people saw her in the performing arts, although one person suggested she become an opera singer. And I said, well, you know, she really doesn't sing. Like, if you go back to Ibsen's Nora, what she does to entertain the neighbors is dance. And she really doesn't actually dance very well, but she has a big personality. So I think the performing arts would have made sense. One of the funniest parts of that, I would ask everyone in Norway, what do you think happened to Nora? And one of the funniest things was when I told them that I was going to have her immigrate to America, many of them were shocked and said to me, but you can't take Nora out of Norway. She's ours. And I said, well, that's a very interesting position. You know, does Hamlet belong to, let me guess, the Danes or the English? That's confusing. So these are fictional characters. So I kind of figured I could take her anywhere I wanted to. At one point in the story, Solvi, who is looking for the sort of long lost feminist, she and her friend Brüka start riffing on the idea of what might have happened to somebody like this. And, you know, they get down to, oh, she was captured by pirates in the Caribbean, or no, she's shooting lions in Africa. So it was fun to have them sort of in a more modern way make up silly stories about what might have happened to Nora.
That's an excellent question. And it's interesting, the name Nora, how it corresponds with Norway, in that, right? In the ownership of that, now that you're pointing that out, fascinating. And in terms of connecting characters together or watching them evolve, I think we want Nora, especially as women or feminists, we want Nora to achieve it all, right? We want her to be the queen of the lions, the lion tamer, the famous opera singer, and all of those things, when the reality of it, and a lot of the things that you've discovered are, boy, a lot more complicated, right? It's easy to be queen of the pirates fictionally. In life, it's a harder climb, but worth it. And I see a lot of Queen of the Pirates in this room right now. So just to recap one more time, we did great on time. Just so you know, I was your timekeeper today and really enjoyed that role. My name is Mary Bennett. I'm the producing artistic director for Bruka Theater, 29 years in downtown Reno. We were blessed by Wendy Swallow's husband, who came in, Charlie Shepard, and united us together to be able to have this conversation and know that these two wonderful ideas were out there. So thank you again, Charlie. Wendy and I are musing about following this up with another book club meeting after people read Wendy's book. And so we will announce a date for that coming up, and we'll announce that on our Brüka website and through our newsletters. Wendy, when you have people read a book, what do you do? About a month out?
A month or 2 months.
Okay.
You know, I'll just say that this is a really fun book to talk about plot and character and why Nora keeps lying about things, and you know how I, as an author, struggled to teach her how to like grow up in the world, as she proved a little recalcitrant at times. But it's a very lively book club discussion book, so I welcome anyone to join us.
And March is Women's History Month. And so let's pick a date so we can have some fun for Women's History Book. You can bring your mimosa or your coffee, or if you're a morning martini girl, any of those things. So our matinee plays tomorrow at Bruka Theater. If you would like more information about our shows, we are running through February 18th. You can go to bruka.org. Again, I would like to thank so much our author, Wendy Swallow. I'd like to thank Rod Hearn, our director, Jessica Johnson, our assistant director and dramaturg. I'd like to thank Holly, Nat Wara, Kimberly Gibbons, and Janet Lazarus for speaking today from the Brüka company side and as actors and creators themselves. And all of you who showed up today to listen to this conversation and are hopefully going to crack open this beautiful book and also come and see us at Brüka Theater. So thank you everyone very much, and
Thank you,
look for
Mary.
more. Okay, enjoy your Saturday. Bye-bye.